I am Joshua, 30 years old, and at my family's Christmas dinner, my own father physically assaulted me to force me to sign over my grandfather's inheritance to my older brother. Before I tell you about the shocking legal trap that left my parents completely speechless and powerless, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The drive to my parents' house in the affluent suburbs of Chicago was always a quiet one. But that night, the silence inside my 5-year-old Honda Civic was thick enough to choke on. The heater blasted dry air against my face, barely fighting off the bitter chill of the December snowstorm whipping against the windshield. Emma, my fiancée, sat beside me in the passenger seat. She had her hands folded neatly in her lap, her knuckles white. She didn't need to say anything. We both knew we were driving into a war zone masquerading as a holiday celebration. We pulled into the sprawling, circular driveway of my childhood home. It was packed with vehicles that cost more than my first mortgage. There was my father's pristine black Mercedes SUV, my mother's sleek Lexus, and parked dead center, taking up 2 spots, was Matthew's leased Porsche. Matthew was my older brother, the golden child, the undisputed center of our family's universe. I parked my Civic out on the street, half buried in a snowdrift, right where the plow had pushed the slush. It was a fitting metaphor for where I stood in the family hierarchy. Stepping through the massive oak front doors, the house smelled like a suffocating mixture of roasted turkey, cinnamon sticks simmering on the stove, and my mother's overpowering floral perfume. It was a smell designed to project warmth and success, but to me, it smelled like an ambush. The dining room was a masterclass in intimidation. The mahogany table was set for 12, though there were only 8 of us. The crystal wine glasses caught the light of the blinking Christmas tree tucked into the corner. I remember looking at the plates and noticing how carefully my mother had folded the red linen napkins into sharp, rigid peaks. She only ever took the time to do that when she needed absolute control, when something incredibly unpleasant was about to happen and she wanted the aesthetics to soften the blow. Matthew sat across from me. He wore a crisp, tailored dress shirt with French cuffs, a luxury he absolutely could not afford on his current non-existent salary. He was carving the roasted turkey with theatrical, agonizing patience. He sliced through the meat like a man rehearsing for a grand role he had already been promised by birthright. Beside me, Emma shifted in her heavy oak chair. Her knee gently bumped mine under the table. It was her silent check-in. I bumped her knee back. The air in the room was completely still. No one was laughing. The instrumental holiday music playing from the hidden ceiling speakers sounded like a funeral dirge. Dad cleared his throat right before the dessert plates were brought out. The metallic clinking of forks against porcelain stopped immediately. My Uncle Robert, who had been aggressively avoiding eye contact all night, suddenly found his water glass fascinating. "We should handle your grandfather's estate paperwork tonight," Dad said. He picked up his glass, swirling the ice, his tone casual, as if he were discussing the incoming winter storm. Clean, efficient. I had known this conversation was coming for weeks. I didn't know the exact timing, but I recognized the tone instantly. It was the tone he used when his word was the law of the land, when dissent was not just discouraged but punishable. He reached into the inner pocket of his dark suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope, the flap heavily sealed. He didn't slide it toward the center of the table. He didn't look at Matthew. He locked his cold, gray eyes on me and slid the envelope directly across the polished wood. It stopped right next to my half-empty wine glass. "You will sign this over to your brother," Dad said. He didn't ask. There was no inflection of a question. It was a pure command. "It's the right thing," my mother chimed in immediately, hitting her mark perfectly. Her voice was smooth, practiced, dripping with fake maternal concern. "He is the firstborn heir, Joshua. It's tradition. It is what your grandfather would have truly wanted if he was thinking clearly at the end." Matthew didn't look at me. He studied his plate, his jaw clenched, his mouth set in a line of polite neutrality. He had perfected that exact look over 30 years of life. Agreeable, harmless, inevitable. He was the king waiting for the peasants to hand over the crown. I stared at the thick white envelope. I didn't touch it. I didn't reach for my pen. I felt something old, dark, and terribly familiar rise in my chest. It wasn't shock. It wasn't even anger, not yet. It was pure, exhausted recognition. The exhaustion of a lifetime spent playing a rigged game. "I'm not signing anything," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room, silencing the holiday music. The room quieted the way a room does right before a massive sheet of glass shatters. Dad leaned forward slowly, resting his heavy forearms on the table. The muscles in his neck tightened. He looked at me as if I had suddenly stood up and spat on the rug. "This isn't about you," he said, his voice dropping an octave into a dangerous gravel. "This is about family legacy, the business, the name." "It is about me," I replied, forcing my heart rate to stay steady. I looked him dead in the eye. "Grandpa left it to me, not to Matthew. To me." I stood up. I didn't push my chair back violently. I just stood, needing to create physical space between myself, that envelope, and the man trying to rob me. That was when Dad stood too. He moved faster than a man his age should. He lunged across the corner of the table, knocking over a crystal salt shaker. He grabbed my arm. His thick fingers dug into my bicep, biting into the muscle through my shirt. Not hard enough to break the bone, but hard enough to send a clear, undeniable physical threat. The dining room instantly shrank around his grip. "You will do as I say," he growled. The mask of the civilized, wealthy patriarch was entirely gone. His teeth were bared. A thick vein pulsed at his temple. "Don't embarrass this family tonight, Joshua. Sign the damn paper." I looked down at his hand on my arm. I noticed the strange, sharp details of the moment. The slight tremor of rage in his wrist. The way my mother looked away toward the window, refusing to witness the violence she helped orchestrate. The way Matthew finally looked up, his eyes wide, calculating the fallout. And then, a calm, incredibly deep voice from the kitchen doorway spoke. "That won't be necessary." Dad froze. His fingers twitched on my arm. We all turned. To understand exactly how this simple holiday dinner turned into a legal execution, you need to know what led us to this frozen, breathless moment. You need to know exactly why my grandfather bypassed his favorite son, bypassed his golden firstborn grandson, and left the keys to the kingdom to the family ghost. I spent my entire life standing in Matthew's shadow. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a total, suffocating eclipse. Matthew was 4 years older, louder, significantly more charming, and effortlessly manipulative. To my parents, he was the rising star, the heir apparent to the upper-middle-class throne they had built. I was just the backup plan, the spare parts. The differences weren't subtle. They were broadcasted daily. When Matthew turned 18, a brand new, silver BMW magically appeared in our wide driveway with a giant red bow on the hood. I remember standing on the porch in my socks, watching Dad hand him the keys with tears of pride in his eyes. When I turned 18 4 years later, I got a firm handshake from Dad in his study and a long, exhausting lecture about the importance of building my own credit score. I ended up working 3 brutal part-time jobs in high school, flipping burgers, stocking grocery shelves at midnight, and mowing lawns, just to afford the insurance and gas for a rusted, beat-up 1998 Toyota that broke down on the highway twice a month. But the real division, the wound that never actually healed, was always financial. When it was time for me to go to college, the narrative in the house drastically shifted. Dad called me into his home office. The room smelled like expensive cigars and leather. The walls were lined with framed photographs of him and Matthew on various hunting trips and golf tournaments. There were no pictures of me. "Joshua, sit down. We need to talk about your college fund," Dad had said, shuffling papers on his mahogany desk, actively refusing to look me in the eye. "Matthew's new tech startup venture needs a massive cash injection. He's on the verge of something huge, a real game changer. We're reallocating the accounts to help him secure a commercial lease. You're a smart kid, smarter than him, honestly. You'll figure out the student loans. It builds character." I was 18 years old. I sat in that leather chair and watched my entire future, the money my grandparents had initially seeded for my education, get handed to my brother to fund a company that went spectacularly bankrupt 9 months later. Matthew didn't even apologize. He just shrugged at the dinner table one night, told everyone the market simply wasn't ready for his visionary genius, and moved back into his sprawling childhood bedroom. I figured it out. I took the high-interest loans. I worked night shifts at a freezing logistics warehouse, loading trucks until my back screamed, while taking a full course load of business classes during the day. I graduated with honors, bleeding sweat and debt. Matthew, meanwhile, was on his third funded sabbatical backpacking through Europe to find himself. The dynamic never changed, no matter how old we got or how much I achieved. Every single milestone I earned was systematically minimized. 5 years ago, when I landed a massive promotion at my corporate logistics firm, a promotion that officially doubled my salary and made me the youngest regional director in the company's history, I made the foolish mistake of inviting my parents and Matthew out to a high-end steakhouse downtown to celebrate. I paid for the entire meal. I bought the expensive wine. When the waiter brought out the champagne, my mother raised her glass. The crystal sparkled in the dim restaurant light. "To Joshua," she said, smiling a thin, tight smile, "you've always had such incredible luck. Right place, right time. The corporate world is so unpredictable. Now, Matthew, tell us more about this new commercial real estate idea of yours. It sounds absolutely thrilling. Luck, the 80-hour work weeks, the missed holidays, the grinding, soul-crushing stress of climbing the ladder while carrying crippling student debt. They looked right at it and called it luck. I sat there, cutting into my medium-rare steak, and I finally realized the brutal truth. In their eyes, I would never actually earn anything. Matthew's catastrophic financial failures were always painted as brave entrepreneurial risks. My hard-fought successes were just selfish accidents. The only person in the entire bloodline who saw through the smoke and mirrors was Grandpa. Arthur Sr. was a hard, unforgiving man. He built a regional manufacturing supply company out of the trunk of his car in the 1960s and sold it for a fortune a decade before I was born. He didn't talk much at family gatherings, but he watched everything. While my parents fawned over Matthew's loud, exaggerated stories in the living room, Grandpa would quietly catch my eye and motion with his cane for me to follow him into the sunroom. We played chess, hundreds of games over the years, sitting in the quiet, dusty sunlight. He never let me win, not once. He was ruthless, calculating, and cold on the board. "Look at the whole board, Joshua," he would say, his raspy voice cutting through the silence of the room. He'd tap his heavy wooden cane against the floorboards for emphasis. "Your brother plays for the immediate prize. He grabs the pawn and exposes his king. Your father plays to look powerful, throwing his knights around to scare people. You have to play 3 moves ahead. You have to see the trap before they even realize they set it. Let them think they are winning until the board belongs to you." I didn't fully understand what he was preparing me for back then. I thought we were just playing a game to pass the time. My Aunt Susan, my dad's younger sister, would sometimes come into the sunroom, bringing us glasses of iced lemonade. She'd ruffle my hair, giving me a sad, deeply pitying look. "You're a good boy, Joshua," she'd whisper, looking over her shoulder to make sure Dad wasn't within earshot. "Don't let Arthur and Eleanor get you down. I see how hard you work. You're special." For years, I believed Aunt Susan was my secret ally. I believed she was the only one in the family who saw the blatant, toxic favoritism and thought it was wrong. I held onto her small, whispered words of comfort like a lifeline. I was an absolute fool. In my family, sympathy wasn't real. It was just another currency used to buy leverage for later. Grandpa knew that. He knew exactly what every single one of them was capable of when the money was finally put on the table. And he made his move long before he took his last breath. Grandpa died in late October. The air in Chicago was already turning bitterly cold, the wind ripping off Lake Michigan. His funeral was a massive, highly orchestrated spectacle. My parents treated it less like a solemn memorial for a patriarch and more like a high-stakes networking event. Dad stood by the casket, shaking hands with local politicians and business owners, his face a mask of dignified grief. Matthew wore a dark, custom-tailored Italian suit, playing the role of the devastated firstborn grandson to absolute, sickening perfection. He even managed to squeeze out a few tears during the eulogy. I stood in the back, near the edge of the cemetery grass, holding Emma's hand tightly. The rain was a slow, freezing mist that soaked into my cheap overcoat. I watched my mother dab her perfectly dry eyes with a black lace handkerchief for the cameras of the local paper. It made my stomach turn. A week after the funeral, I was sitting in my apartment, going over quarterly reports, when I received a thick, heavy envelope in the mail. It was sealed with actual red wax. The return address belonged to Mr. Halverson, Grandpa's personal attorney. Halverson had been a fixture in our family's periphery for 2 decades. He was a tall, silent, unsmiling man in a gray suit who handled all the trusts, the corporate structures, and the taxes. He never stayed for dinner. He never made small talk. My hands shook slightly as I broke the seal. The letter inside was typed on thick, cream-colored stationery. It was brief, devoid of any legal jargon, and terrifyingly clear. It stated that the primary reading of the will had been intentionally bypassed by my grandfather's explicit, legally binding instructions. A private transfer of assets was already in motion. I was the sole beneficiary of the primary inheritance. The investment portfolios, the liquid cash, the holding companies, everything. The numbers attached to the bottom of the page made my vision blur. It wasn't just money. It was generational wealth. It was enough to change my life forever. It was enough to build an empire. But the final paragraph of Halverson's letter is what made the blood run completely cold in my veins. Your grandfather anticipated heavy resistance from your father and brother. He advised me to tell you the following. Do not speak of this to anyone. Let them come to you. They will assume the money is theirs. They will try to take it from you when they realize the truth. Hold your ground. I will be there when the time comes. I folded the letter. I didn't tell a soul. Not even Emma, not for the first few weeks. I needed to process it. I needed to see how the board was set before I made my first move. The shift in the family dynamic was almost instantaneous and deeply unsettling. A frantic, nervous, vibrating energy infected my parents. They started calling me twice a week, asking about my job, my health, my wedding plans with Emma. My mother, who usually communicated via passive-aggressive texts once a month, suddenly wanted to know my favorite recipes. Dad invited me to play golf. It was terrifyingly out of character. Matthew, who usually ignored my existence unless he needed someone to co-sign a lease, suddenly wanted to grab a beer and catch up. I knew they hadn't seen the will yet. Halverson was legally holding it tight. But they knew something was wrong. The massive wire transfers hadn't magically appeared in Matthew's business accounts. The bank hadn't called my dad to hand over the keys to the kingdom. They were fishing in the dark, and they were getting desperate. The ugly truth of their desperation spilled out completely the week before Christmas. I had stopped by my parents' house on a Tuesday afternoon to drop off a holiday gift basket from Emma. Their cars were in the driveway, but nobody answered the front doorbell. The side wooden gate leading to the backyard patio was unlatched, swinging slightly in the wind, so I walked around back, thinking Dad was out by the grill. I stopped dead in my tracks, pressing my back against the cold brick wall right next to the kitchen window. The glass was cracked open slightly to let out the smoke from whatever my mother was burning on the stove. Inside, Matthew was pacing furiously back and forth across the expensive slate tile floor. His wife, Sarah, was sitting at the Marble Island counter. Sarah always played the quiet, fiercely supportive wife in public. She smiled sweetly, baked organic pies for charity bake sales, and wore pastel cardigans. But right now, her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered venom. Her voice was a low, dangerous hiss. "You promised me, Matt," Sarah spat, gripping the edge of the marble counter so hard her knuckles were stark white. "You looked me in the eye and said the estate money would be cleared by the first week of December. The investors are calling my personal cell phone now. They are threatening to sue for fraud. If they look at the books, if they see what you actually did with the capital to pay off your gambling debts. I know, Matthew shouted, ripping his hands through his perfectly styled hair. His face was red, sweating despite the cold outside. I know, Sarah. Dad is handling it. The damn lawyer, Halverson, is just dragging his feet with probate. We're going to get it. Dad said the old man left everything to the firstborn. It's tradition. You better get it, Sarah said, standing up and pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at his chest. I am not going down with you. I am not going to prison because you wanted to play big shot CEO. If this real estate shell company goes bankrupt, I am filing for divorce so fast your head will spin. I will take the house, I will take the cars, and I swear to God, I will take full custody of the dog. You fix this. You make Joshua sign over whatever pathetic little piece they threw at him, or you're dead to me. I stepped back from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My breath plumed in the freezing air. Matthew wasn't just waiting for a windfall to buy a new boat. He was drowning. He had actively defrauded his own investors to fund his luxury lifestyle and cover his massive debts. And now the bill had come due with a vengeance. And Sarah, the sweet, demure sister-in-law, was the architect holding the whip, threatening to destroy him. They needed Grandpa's inheritance to cover up a massive financial crime. I walked quietly back to my car, the gravel crunching loudly under my boots. The cold wind bit at my face, but my mind was completely, sharply clear. Grandpa had known. He had watched Matthew's businesses operate. He knew Matthew would destroy the family legacy to save his own skin. He knew Dad would enable him, covering up the crimes to protect the family image. He left it to me because he knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I was the only one who wouldn't burn it to the ground. The battlefield was officially set. Christmas dinner wasn't going to be a celebration of family. It was going to be an ambush. We arrived at my parents' house at exactly 6 o'clock on Christmas Eve. Before we walked up the wide brick porch steps, Emma stopped me. She grabbed the lapels of my winter coat, her dark eyes locking fiercely onto mine. I had told her everything 2 nights ago, the exact amount of the money, Halverson's cryptic letter, the devastating conversation I had overheard between Matthew and Sarah. You don't owe them a single thing, Joshua, Emma said softly, but her grip on my coat was like iron. Whatever happens in that room tonight, you hold your ground. Do not let them shrink you. I am right beside you. I've got your back. I nodded, taking a deep, freezing breath. I know. Let's get this over with. The moment we stepped inside the foyer, the atmosphere was suffocating. The house was decorated to the extreme, thick green garlands cascading down the grand spiral staircase. A 12-foot imported fir tree dripping in expensive glass ornaments. Frank Sinatra was playing softly on the surround sound system. It looked like a movie set, and everyone was in costume. My mother greeted us at the door with a smile that didn't reach her cold eyes. Joshua, Emma, so glad you could make it through the snow, she sang, reaching out to take our coats. Her eyes immediately darted downward, checking my hands and Emma's purse to see if we were carrying anything resembling legal documents or folders. We moved to the sunken living room. Matthew was standing by the stone fireplace, aggressively nursing a glass of neat scotch. He looked terrible up close. His skin was pale, ashen, and there were dark, heavy circles under his eyes. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. Sarah was sitting perfectly straight on the white leather sofa, her posture rigid, her eyes tracking me across the room like a sniper zeroing in on a target. Dad was holding court by the mahogany wet bar. He poured me a bourbon, his heavy hand clapping down on my shoulder with fake, boisterous affection. Good to see you, son. Tonight is about family, about sticking together when times are tough. I took the glass, feeling the burn of the liquor. Always, Dad. Dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. We sat down at the massive table. Emma immediately noticed the tactical seating arrangement. They had placed me dead center on the long side of the table, flanked by my father on my immediate left and Aunt Susan on my right. Matthew and Sarah were directly across from me. Uncle Robert sat at the far end, out of the line of fire. It was a military formation. They had me completely surrounded, cutting off any physical escape route. The meal progressed in agonizingly slow motion. We ate the dry turkey. We passed the mashed potatoes. The conversation was shallow, aggressive small talk. Matthew bragged about a fictitious new client. Dad talked about the stock market. But the underlying tension was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I chewed my food, tasting absolutely nothing. Then came the moment. Dad cleared his throat. The clinking of silverware vanished. The trap was sprung. He delivered a long, emotional speech about family legacy. He talked about how Grandpa built everything from scratch with his bare hands. He talked about the sacred duty of tradition. And then he produced the envelope. "You will sign this over to your brother," Dad commanded, sliding the thick paper toward me. As the envelope stopped near my glass, Aunt Susan leaned in close to me. The aunt who used to bring me lemonade. The aunt who told me she saw how hard I worked. "Just sign it, sweetie," Susan whispered, her voice trembling slightly, her breath smelling of cheap red wine. She placed a warm, clammy hand over mine. "Don't cause a scene tonight. Your brother really needs this right now. The family needs peace. We all have to make sacrifices for the greater good." I turned my head and looked at her. I really looked at her. Her eyes were wide, dilated, deeply panicked. And in that split second, the final puzzle piece clicked into place. Susan wasn't acting out of a desire for family harmony. She was terrified for her own survival. "How much did you lend him, Susan?" I asked. My voice was barely above a whisper, but in the dead silence of the room, it rang out like a bell. Susan flinched violently as if I had physically slapped her. She pulled her hand back from mine instantly, knocking her fork onto the floor. Matthew's head snapped up. Sarah closed her eyes and let out a long, slow breath. "How much of your retirement money did you give Matthew for his real estate scam?" I pressed, my voice hardening, turning to face her fully. "You're not asking me to make peace. You're asking me to bail you out because you know he lost it all. That is enough," Dad roared, slamming his heavy fist onto the mahogany table. The crystal wine glasses shook, sloshing red liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. "I'm not signing anything," I said loudly, pushing my heavy oak chair back, the wood scraping harshly against the floor. The illusion of a happy family shattered completely into a million jagged pieces. Dad stood up, his face flushed a dangerous, deep purple with rage. He lunged across the corner of the table. His heavy, calloused hand clamped down on my arm, his fingers digging brutally into my muscle. "You will do as I say," he growled, leaning into my face, his breath hot. The civilized veneer was completely stripped away, revealing the bully underneath. "Don't embarrass this family. You are nothing without this family." I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. I felt a massive surge of pure, blinding adrenaline. I was 30 years old, a grown man, a successful executive, and my father was trying to physically intimidate me into giving away millions of dollars to save a fraud and protect his own ego. And then, the voice from the kitchen doorway cut through the room like a scythe. "That won't be necessary." Dad froze. His grip on my arm loosened slightly in pure shock, but he didn't let go. We all turned our heads toward the archway leading to the kitchen. Mr. Halverson stood there. He was wearing his heavy wool winter coat, snowflakes still visibly melting on the broad shoulders. He carried a slim, worn leather briefcase in his gloved hand. No one had heard him come in through the side door. My mother had actually invited him, assuming he was there to facilitate my surrender, to notarize the paperwork of my defeat. She had thought she was weaponizing Grandpa's lawyer against me. "Why are you standing there lurking in the dark?" Dad demanded, recovering his aggressive posture, puffing his chest out. "Get in here, Halverson. Tell this ungrateful kid what his legal obligations are to his family. Tell him about the trust." Halverson stepped into the dining room. He didn't rush. He didn't look intimidated by my father's yelling. He walked with the slow, measured, terrifying pace of an executioner who knew exactly how the sentence would end. He walked past Matthew, past my mother, and stood directly behind my chair. He placed his leather briefcase on the table, right next to the untouched envelope my father had thrown at me. He clicked the brass locks open. The sharp, metallic sound echoed loudly in the silent, tense room. "I am here," Halverson said, his voice smooth, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. Because Arthur Sr. anticipated this exact conversation. He anticipated the coercion. He anticipated the aggression. Silence thickened. You could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Halverson looked down at me, not asking for permission, but acknowledging my position as the head of the board. I gave a single, slow nod. Checkmate. The estate was structured intentionally over the last 3 years, Halverson continued, pulling a stack of heavy, watermarked legal documents from his briefcase and laying them flat on the table. The primary inheritance, including all liquid assets, the investment portfolios, the stock options, and the holding companies, were granted solely, entirely, and irrevocably to Joshua. Matthew let out a sound that was half scoff, half choke. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "It's just money. I'm the oldest. I'm the firstborn. I'm running a business. He's just a corporate drone. You can't do this." Halverson's gaze flicked to Matthew. His eyes were like glacial ice. "If it is just money, Matthew, then it should not be difficult for you to earn your own, or to pay back your angry investors without relying on stealing your younger brother's assets to cover your fraud." Sarah gasped loudly, covering her mouth. Matthew went completely pale, looking like he was going to vomit right onto his plate. "Now," Halverson said, turning his attention directly to my father, who was still standing, his hand hovering inches from my arm. "We come to the matter of this house." Dad blinked, confused. "My house? What the hell does my house have to do with this?" "Everything," Halverson replied coolly. He pulled out a specific single sheet of paper with a red seal at the bottom. "Your father, Arthur Sr., still legally owned the deed to this property. He allowed you to live here rent-free for 30 years. In his will, he transferred the deed to you, Arthur. However," Halverson paused. He let the agonizing silence stretch, actively tightening the noose around my parents' necks. He attached a very specific, legally ironclad anti-coercion clause. The clause explicitly states that if there is any attempt by you, your wife, or Matthew to coerce, manipulate, or force Joshua to transfer his inheritance under duress, including physical intimidation, which I have just stood here and witnessed, the transfer of this house is immediately and permanently voided. My mother let out a small, terrified, high-pitched shriek. She covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with sheer terror. "Voided," Dad whispered, the anger completely drained from his face, replaced by sudden, catastrophic, paralyzing fear. "Voided," Halverson confirmed firmly, tapping the document. "The deed automatically defaults to the primary beneficiary, Joshua. If you push him to sign that envelope, Arthur, you do not gain his inheritance. You lose your home. Immediately. I have the eviction paperwork drafted in my car right now. Would you like me to go get it?" The air in the room vanished. The absolute power dynamic, the toxic hierarchy that had ruled my entire life, collapsed in less than 60 seconds. Dad looked at the useless envelope on the table. He looked at Halverson's impassive face. Then, slowly, painfully, he looked at me. For the first time in 30 years, there was no arrogance in his eyes. There was no authority, only total, crushing defeat. This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in getting this far. You are amazing. Please like the video and leave a comment below to let me know you've been with me. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. The physical weight of Dad's hand was completely gone from my arm. He slowly lowered himself back into his heavy chair, moving like an old, broken man. He didn't speak. He just stared blankly at the expensive crystal water glass in front of him. He looked like a man who had stepped on a landmine and was just waiting for the inevitable click. My mother, realizing that the aggressive, domineering approach had utterly failed, instantly pivoted to her secondary weapon, playing the ultimate wounded victim. Tears streamed down her meticulously powdered face, ruining her makeup. "Joshua," she sobbed, her voice trembling with manufactured heartbreak, reaching her hands out across the table toward me. "How can you do this to us? How can you sit there and let this cold man threaten your own flesh and blood with homelessness on Christmas Eve? You're choosing money over your family. Your grandfather was sick. He was cruel and senile to do this to us. He didn't know what he was doing." I looked at her. I searched my heart for a shred of sympathy, a shred of the guilt that used to control me. I felt absolutely nothing. The invisible strings she had pulled my entire life were severed permanently. "Grandpa wasn't cruel, Mom," I said, my voice eerily calm, echoing in the quiet room. "He just saw you. He saw all of you for exactly what you are. He knew exactly what you would do to me if he didn't put a loaded legal gun to your head to stop it." I looked over at Uncle Robert, Dad's younger brother, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table the entire time. He was the reluctant witness. He knew the emotional abuse I took for years. He knew Matthew was a reckless fraud. But right now, Robert was aggressively staring at his half-eaten mashed potatoes, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. He was a coward, just like the rest of them, preferring peace at the cost of my sanity. "Nobody is kicking you out of the house, Mom," I said, standing up tall. I looked down at my father. "You can keep the house, as long as you never, ever ask me for a single dime to fund Matthew's failures. As long as you never try to dictate my life, my career, or my marriage again. The bank is closed. Forever." Emma stood up beside me. She didn't say a word, but she didn't need to. Her presence was an unshakable fortress. She picked up her purse and slung it over her shoulder. "This is ridiculous," Matthew finally snapped, slamming his hands on the table, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You're destroying the family business, Josh. I'm going to lose everything. The investors are going to ruin me." "You already lost it, Matt," I replied, grabbing Emma's coat from the back of her chair and helping her into it. "You lost it when you lied on your loan applications. I'm not your safety net anymore. Fix your own life." Sarah stood up, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. She grabbed her designer purse, her face a mask of furious, undisguised disgust. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at my parents. She glared directly at Matthew. "Call me when your lawyers figure out how you're keeping me out of federal jail," Sarah spat at her husband. Without another word to anyone, she turned on her heel and marched out of the dining room. The heavy oak front door slammed shut a moment later, rattling the windows. The sound echoed through the silent house like a gunshot. Matthew buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a pathetic sob. Aunt Susan was quietly crying into her napkin, mourning her lost retirement fund. I looked around the room one last time. The beautiful, expensive decorations, the perfect, untouched roasted turkey, the blinking festive lights. It was a beautiful stage designed for a very ugly play, and my part in it was officially over. Mr. Halverson gathered his documents, snapped his briefcase shut with a final, decisive click, and gave me a slight, respectful nod. He walked out the back door, disappearing into the cold night as quietly as he had arrived. "This will change things, Joshua," Dad said, not looking up from the table. His voice was hollow, scraped out. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was a complete surrender. "I know," I answered simply. Emma and I walked out of the dining room, down the long, carpeted hallway, and out the front door. We stepped off the porch and into the freezing December night. The snow was falling much heavier now, thick white flakes covering the luxury cars in the driveway, covering the perfectly manicured lawn. The cold air hit my lungs, And for the first time in my entire life, it felt incredibly clean. I wasn't just walking away from a ruined holiday dinner. I was walking out of a psychological prison I had lived in for 30 years. I squeezed Emma's hand, and we walked down the dark street toward my old, beat-up car, leaving the wreckage of my family's lies buried deep in the snow behind us. 2 years have passed since that freezing Christmas Eve. 2 years since I walked out of my parents' front door, held Emma's hand, and left the toxic, suffocating illusion of our family completely behind me in the snow. People often ask me in the comments on my older videos what happens after the big dramatic confrontation. Movies and television shows usually end right there. The hero says his piece, the villains are left speechless, the music swells, and the credits roll as he walks off into the winter night. But in real life, the sun comes up the next morning. You wake up in your own bed, make a pot of coffee, and you have to figure out how to actually live the life you just fought so hard to protect. You have to build something out of the silence. And the immediate aftermath of that night was exactly that. Total, deafening, heavy silence. For the first few weeks of January, I kept my phone on my desk at work, fully expecting the screen to light up with my father's name. I expected him to show up at my apartment complex, red-faced, pounding on the door, and screaming about disrespect. I expected my mother to stage some kind of elaborate, fake medical emergency just to force me to rush to the hospital so she could corner me in a waiting room. I braced myself for Aunt Susan to ambush me in the parking lot of my office. But nothing happened. The phone didn't ring. There were no unannounced visits. Mr. Halverson's legal trap was so perfectly executed, so incredibly ironclad, that it completely paralyzed them. They were terrified. For the first time in my father's life, he was not the one holding the cards. They knew that one wrong move, one aggressive phone call, or one threatening text message demanding a piece of the inheritance could legally trigger the anti-coercion clause. If they pushed me even an inch, they would lose the deed to the massive suburban house they were living in. Grandpa had essentially built an invisible electric fence around my life, and my parents knew exactly how high the voltage was. So, I took the massive, quiet space they were forced to give me, and I started building my future. I didn't go out and buy a fleet of luxury sports cars to post on social media. I didn't buy a massive 10-bedroom mansion just to show off to people I didn't even like. I remembered what my grandfather taught me over all those quiet games of chess in his sunroom. I looked 3 moves ahead. The board finally belonged to me, and I was going to secure my king. I took the inheritance and sat down with a team of top-tier financial advisors in the city. We spent weeks going over the numbers, structuring the assets so they would be bulletproof. I invested the vast bulk of the money into a highly diversified portfolio of sustainable, long-term index funds, municipal bonds, and low-risk commercial real estate trusts. I didn't want the flashy, high-risk gambling that my brother Matthew loved. I wanted absolute stability. I wanted the kind of generational wealth that is quiet, the kind that grows in the background and lets you sleep completely soundly at night without checking the stock market every 5 minutes. With the remaining liquid capital, I made the biggest move of my career. I finally walked into my boss's office and quit my grueling corporate job. I had spent years climbing that ladder, securing promotion after promotion, doubling my salary just to prove my worth to a family that never cared. But I didn't need their validation anymore. I used my years of hard-fought experience, my deep understanding of the industry, and my extensive list of professional contacts to start my own mid-sized logistics consulting firm. I rented a bright, modest office space in a good part of downtown Chicago. I bought sturdy desks, good computers, and I hired a small, fiercely dedicated team of people who were hungry to build something real. It was incredibly hard work. The 80-hour weeks didn't magically disappear just because I had money in the bank. But the exhaustion felt completely different. For the first time in my life, I was working entirely for myself. I wasn't carrying the massive, crushing weight of my brother's financial failures. I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder to see if my father approved. Every single hour I put into that office built my own legacy, not theirs. And as my professional life flourished, my personal life blossomed in ways I never thought possible. 6 months after the Christmas incident, in late June, Emma and I finally got married. We didn't have a massive 500-guest spectacle at a country club. We didn't hire a 10-piece band or a celebrity photographer. My parents always wanted Matthew to have a wedding like that. A massive networking event disguised as a celebration of love, where Dad could smoke cigars with local politicians and Mom could show off custom floral arrangements. Emma and I wanted the exact opposite. We rented a beautiful, historic botanical garden on a warm, breezy Tuesday afternoon. The sun was shining, and the air smelled like blooming jasmine and fresh earth. There were exactly 35 people there. It was just Emma's family, our closest, most loyal friends, and a few of my old college roommates who had seen me eating ramen noodles in my dorm room because my college fund had been stolen. I didn't invite my parents. I didn't invite Matthew. I didn't even invite Aunt Susan. Standing at the altar that afternoon, looking at Emma in her simple, elegant white dress, surrounded by lush green trees and people who actually loved us for who we were, I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. There was no underlying tension in the air. I didn't have to scan the crowd to see if my father was glaring at me or if Matthew was trying to make the toast all about himself. There were no whispered insults, no backhanded compliments about my salary, no subtle digs about my choices. It was just joy. Pure, unadulterated, uncomplicated joy. Surprisingly, Mr. Halverson actually attended the ceremony. He sat quietly in the very back row, wearing his signature impeccably tailored gray suit. As Emma and I walked back down the aisle together as husband and wife, the crowd cheering and throwing flower petals, I caught his eye. He gave me that same slight, deeply respectful nod he had given me in the dining room. It was a silent acknowledgement. We had won the war. While my life was rapidly moving forward into the light, the toxic, fragile empire my parents had spent 30 years building around Matthew was rapidly, violently collapsing into dust. I didn't go looking for the information. I didn't stalk their social media or hire a private investigator. I heard all the ugly details through the grapevine. The city is big, but the circles of wealthy suburban gossip are incredibly small. People from my parents' country club and old family friends simply couldn't resist calling me to share the disaster, hoping I would give them the inside scoop on the family drama. Matthew's fraudulent commercial real estate venture imploded spectacularly by the end of January, barely a month after the Christmas dinner. Without the massive, multi-million-dollar cash injection he was expecting to steal from my inheritance, he simply couldn't hide the missing funds anymore. His angry investors finally lost their patience and demanded a full, independent forensic audit of his company's books. When the auditors dug into the accounts, they didn't just find poor business decisions. They found blatant criminal theft. They saw the cooked books and realized Matthew had been actively funneling their investment capital into offshore accounts to pay off massive personal gambling debts. He had used their money to fund luxury vacations to Aspen, to buy expensive watches, and to lease that beautiful Porsche he parked in my parents' driveway. The investors immediately filed a massive, multi-million-dollar class action lawsuit for fraud and gross negligence. They wanted his head on a spike. The moment the legal papers were served by a federal courier, Sarah made her move. Just like I had heard her threaten through the cracked kitchen window that cold afternoon, she didn't hesitate for a single second. She saw the sinking ship, and she secured her own lifeboat. She filed for divorce the very next morning. It was an absolute bloodbath in the family court system. Sarah didn't just want out. She wanted to leave a crater where Matthew's life used to be. She hired the most ruthless, aggressive divorce lawyer in the entire state of Illinois. She successfully argued that Matthew had committed extreme financial infidelity and endangered her livelihood and reputation. Since they had no children to fight over, the custody battle became entirely, viciously focused on the remaining assets. She fought tooth and nail for custody of their purebred golden retriever. She fought for the remaining leased luxury vehicles. She legally laid claim to every single piece of expensive furniture, art, and jewelry inside their luxury downtown penthouse. She painted herself as the innocent, naive wife who was horribly deceived by a monster. The judge bought every single tear she cried on the stand. She won almost everything. She left Matthew with absolutely nothing but the designer clothes in his suitcase and a mountain of federal legal trouble that threatened to put him behind bars for a decade. Matthew was completely, thoroughly ruined. The golden child, the firstborn heir who was supposed to carry the proud family name into the stratosphere, was facing potential federal prison time and complete, unrecoverable personal bankruptcy. And my parents, completely unable to break their lifelong, toxic habit of enabling him, stepped right in to save their favorite son from the consequences of his own actions. Because I had legally and permanently blocked them from touching my money, they had to use their own safety net. They went to the bank and took out a massive, high-interest second mortgage on the house. The very same house I had generously allowed them to keep by not pressing the issue. They drained every single penny of their own retirement accounts. They sold my mother's jewelry. They sold my father's vintage car collection. They liquidated everything they had spent 40 years accumulating just to pay for Matthew's high-priced criminal defense lawyer and to secure a massive out-of-court financial settlement with the angry investors to keep him from going to federal prison. Matthew avoided a jail cell by the absolute skin of his teeth, but the cost to my parents was absolute, grinding devastation. He had to move back into his childhood bedroom at 36 years old, a disgraced, bankrupt man with no prospects and a ruined reputation in the city. My parents, who were supposed to be spending their golden years traveling through Europe, drinking fine wine, and playing golf at the exclusive country club, are now drowning in a massive sea of toxic debt. They had to cancel their country club membership. My father had to take a consulting job he hates just to cover the monthly interest payments on the second mortgage. They are essentially living paycheck to paycheck, trapped in a giant, drafty, empty house they can barely afford to heat in the harsh Chicago winters, completely supporting a grown man who still refuses to get a real job because he thinks working a regular salary is beneath his dignity. The holidays are completely different for me now. The knot of anxiety that used to form in my stomach every November is totally gone. Emma and I spend Thanksgiving cooking together in our own warm kitchen, drinking good wine, laughing and watching football with the dog sleeping by the fire. We spend Christmas with her parents in Ohio, surrounded by loud, chaotic, genuine, unconditional love. We exchange thoughtful, inexpensive gifts, and nobody brings up stock portfolios or legacy. Every once in a while, usually right around a major holiday or on my birthday, my phone will buzz on the kitchen counter. I will look down and see a text message from my mother. It is always the exact same predictable script. Even after everything that happened, she still plays the ultimate wounded victim. Thinking of you today, Joshua. The house is so incredibly quiet without you here. Dad was just talking about you. We miss our family being whole. Life is far too short to hold on to this much bitter anger. We are family. Please call your father, he's not sleeping well at all. We love you. I read the texts. I don't feel anger anymore. My blood doesn't boil. I don't feel the crushing guilt she engineered me to feel. I just feel a deep, hollow, quiet pity. They still don't understand. After all the ruin, after losing their retirement and their peace of mind, they still think I am punishing them out of pure spite. They refuse to look in the mirror and acknowledge that their own toxic favoritism, their constant enabling, and their blinding greed are exactly what burned the family down to the studs. They want me to come back and fix it. They want me to open my checkbook and save them from the reality they created. I never engage with the emotional manipulation. I never write a long paragraph defending myself. I reply with a simple, cold, polite response. Emma and I are doing very well. Happy holidays to you too. I hit send, and I put the phone away. That is the only access they get to my life now. A polite, impenetrable, reinforced brick wall. I set the boundary, and I enforce it with absolute iron discipline. Last week, the autumn leaves were turning brilliant shades of orange, gold, and blood red across the city. The air was crisp, cool, and smelled like wood smoke. I took a Friday afternoon off from work. I didn't tell anyone at the office where I was going. I just drove out of the city limits, stopped at a small florist off the highway, bought a simple bouquet of white lilies, and drove out to the cemetery. The grounds were incredibly quiet, save for the wind rustling loudly through the massive, ancient oak trees that lined the paved driving paths. I walked past the massive, ostentatious marble family monuments, the towering angels and the heavy stone crosses. I kept walking until I found the simple, flat, unpretentious granite marker I was looking for. Arthur Sr., my grandfather. The funeral 2 years ago had been a grotesque, fake show put on by my parents. But this visit was real. It was just me, the wind, and the man who truly saved my life. I knelt down on the damp, cold grass and placed the white lilies carefully next to the headstone, brushing away a few fallen brown leaves from the carved lettering. I stayed kneeling there for a long time, just listening to the distant sound of highway traffic and looking at his name carved deeply into the gray stone. "You were right, Grandpa," I said softly, the words instantly carried away by the autumn breeze. I looked 3 moves ahead. I saw the trap they were setting. I saw the whole board, and I didn't let them take it. I realized sitting there, with my hands resting on my knees, that Grandpa didn't just leave me a massive financial inheritance. Yes, the money was a powerful tool. It provided immense security, it funded my business, and it gave me the freedom to breathe without panic. But the real inheritance he left me, the most valuable thing he passed down, was the absolute truth. He gave me the ultimate validation I had been desperately seeking my entire life. From the moment Dad stole my college fund to pay for Matthew's mistakes, my family had systematically tried to convince me that I was less than. They tried to brainwash me into believing I was selfish, that I was difficult, that I was only successful in my career because of blind, unearned luck. They wanted me to believe I was a supporting character in Matthew's grand story. Grandpa's will was a final, undeniable, legally binding testament that he saw right through all of it. He saw my grueling hard work. He saw my quiet integrity. He saw the rot inside my father and the weakness inside my brother. And he trusted me over the golden child. More importantly, he gave me the power to walk away. We are taught from a very young age that power looks a certain way. We think power is shouting at the head of a mahogany dining table. We think it looks like a father physically grabbing his son's arm to force submission. We think it's demanding respect based on an arbitrary birth order or a family title. But sitting by that grave, I finally understood what real power is. Sometimes, the most incredible, earth-shattering display of power is simply the moment you realize you do not have to participate in the sick game anymore. It is the profound realization that you are holding the pen, and you do not have to sign the paper. It is the moment a toxic hand lets go of your arm, and you actively choose not to reach back out to them. I stood up, taking a deep breath of the cold air, and brushed the dirt and damp grass off the knees of my jeans. I looked out over the rolling green hills of the quiet cemetery. I am 32 years old now. I have a beautiful, brilliant, fiercely loyal wife who stood by me when I had nothing but a piece of paper and a threat. I have a thriving business that I built from the ground up with my own sweat and strategy. I have a home filled with genuine peace, laughter, and mutual respect. I am not the backup plan anymore. I am not the family bank. I am the sole architect of my own life. My father told me that night, standing in the hallway, that walking out the front door would change things. He meant it as a dark warning. He meant that I would lose their protection, their love, and my place in the family hierarchy. He was absolutely right. Changed everything. Saved my life. Before we wrap up this video today, I want to take a moment to look directly at the camera and share something critically important with all of you watching this right now. If there is one crucial educational lesson, one deep takeaway you get from my entire experience with my family, please let it be this. Family is not a free pass for abuse, manipulation, or financial exploitation. We are deeply conditioned by our culture, by movies, and by society to believe that blood relation means absolute, unquestioning loyalty. We are told that we must tolerate toxic behavior, disrespect, and even outright theft simply because we share a last name or a DNA profile with someone. But that is a dangerous, destructive lie. Respect is something that must be earned every single day, and real love should never, ever come with a hidden financial invoice or a demand for your soul. Setting strict, immovable boundaries with toxic family members is not an act of cruelty, selfishness, or disrespect. It is an act of profound, necessary self-preservation. You have the absolute human right to protect your peace of mind, your hard-earned assets, and your mental health from anyone who tries to tear them down. It doesn't matter if those people are strangers on the street, or if they are the people sitting right across from you at the Thanksgiving table passing the mashed potatoes. If they are hurting you, you have the right to walk away and never look back. Do not let anyone guilt you into setting yourself on fire just to keep them warm. I would love to hear from you now. This community has been incredibly supportive, and I value your perspective. What is the most important lesson or takeaway you got from my story today? Have you ever had to set a difficult boundary with a family member to protect your own peace? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments section below. Or, if this story resonated with you, if you found value in the lessons shared, and if you agree with the hard boundaries I had to set, simply drop the word good in the comments right now. It lets me know that sharing this difficult, deeply personal journey was worth the effort, and that we are building a strong, emotionally intelligent, and supportive community here together. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Stay strong out there, and I will see you in the next video.